Winter, in most of North America before central heating and hand sanitizer, wasn't a poetic postcard. It was a survival exam graded by frostbite. While European settlers spent December inventing new ways to freeze to death in their own shoes, indigenous communities were already rolling into winter with systems so practical they bordered on genius or madness. Depending on how much you enjoy bathing at -20 degrees Celsius, hygiene didn't disappear in the snow. It simply put on a fur coat and adapted. Cleanliness for many tribes wasn't a seasonal hobby. It was tied to spiritual balance, health, and what could politely be called not dying of infection. Sweat lodges steamed in the sub-zero air. Frozen rivers doubled as natural bathtubs, and snow became the year's most abundant cleaning supply. Imagine bathing with what's trying to kill you, and doing it willingly. While settlers were stacking chamber pots and praying for spring, indigenous families were melting snow in clay pots, scrubbing with cattail fibers, and washing in quick, brutal bursts that probably made the ancestors of cold plungers very proud. The logic was beautifully simple. If dirt and sickness stuck to the body, then the cold was a purifier, not a punishment. You didn't fight it, you collaborated with it. Steam was coaxed out of hot stones in a closed lodge until bodies glistened. Then came the plunge into snow or icy water, sealing pores and shocking life back into flesh. Modern people call that a wellness retreat. They called it Tuesday. And hygiene wasn't vanity, it was defense. Winter's air was dry, smoke-filled and unforgiving. Soot from fires clung to skin and lungs, so periodic cleansing wasn't optional unless one fancied an early respiratory apocalypse. Even the air inside lodges, rich with smoke and breath, demanded regular purification. When one lives cheek to cheek with family, hides, and half a year of stored food, one quickly learns that cleanliness isn't moral, it's mathematical. Less grime equals fewer fleas. Less moisture equals fewer infections. The real miracle wasn't surviving the cold. It was doing it while still smelling vaguely of sage. Seasonal transitions came with ceremony, too. The first frost wasn't met with despair, but with preparation, repairs to lodges, reorganizing supplies, and marking new routines for cleansing and disposal. Winter meant more ritual bathing, not less, because cleanliness was spiritual armor against disease. To be dirty was to invite imbalance, which was just a poetic way of saying you're next. Everything was cyclic. Filth followed decay. Decay followed neglect, and neglect had no place in a season that punished hesitation. And yet, there was humor in it. The quiet absurdity of people bathing in rivers that froze seconds later. The stoic grace of elders teaching children how to roll in snow for health, as if frostbite were a lesson in discipline. There was dignity in that ritual resistance, in turning something unbearable into something purifying. The winter didn't erase hygiene, it made it sacred. And once the ice had settled, once the fires crackled, and the world was wrapped in white silence, there was another secret, the hidden architecture of survival, where one went, quite literally, to do one's business, when the ground itself turned to stone. Once the cold settled in for good, the idea of going outside acquired a new layer of existential risk. The ground was iron, the wind sharp enough to file your bones, and the nearest patch of privacy could icily double as a hypothermia trap. And yet, nature calls, even in blizzards. The ingenuity with which indigenous peoples managed basic sanitation during deep winter is the kind of brilliance rarely discussed in textbooks. Perhaps because it's hard to look dignified while discussing frozen excrement. Different nations solved the same problem in wildly clever ways. In the northern plains, small pits dug before the freeze served as winter latrines, pre-dug, covered, and marked like sacred ground. Because once the earth froze solid, you weren't digging anything but your own grave. Arctic and subarctic peoples, living on permafrost, didn't bother pretending. Waste was deposited in designated snow pits or carried away from camp, usually downwind, a detail often overlooked by explorers who complained that the natives' camps smelled cleaner than ours. They did, because those explorers were living knee-deep in their own mistakes. For groups in wooded regions, like the Anishinaabe Cree, shelter design also helped. Wigwams and winter lodges often had external chambers or screened extensions, primitive outhouses before outhouses were a thing. They weren't luxurious, but they spared one the joy of sprinting half-naked into a snowstorm at 3 a.m. Some lodges even placed their latrines downhill, or near the edge of camp to prevent runoff contamination in spring. That's right, Centuries before anyone muttered the word sewage system, these so-called primitives were engineering winter sanitation, with more foresight than most modern music festivals. Inside, waste was handled with pragmatism. Ashes from hearth fires, rich in lye, were sprinkled over refuse to absorb moisture and odor. In frozen environments, this created a kind of natural composting system that could later be safely buried when the thaw returned. The principle was simple. Nothing filthy stayed close to where people ate, slept, or prayed. Clean fire, clean air, clean bodies, clean minds. Hygiene wasn't decoration, it was theology. And if you're wondering about privacy, yes, it existed, just not in the Instagrammable sense. Snow walls, brush screens, or small rock shelters were enough. Modesty was practical, not prudish. The human body was a vessel to be maintained, not hidden behind the illusion of plumbing. In winter camps, every act, from washing to relieving oneself, was part of maintaining balance with the frozen world. No one was too holy for hygiene, and no one too important to shovel snow. The irony, of course, is that centuries later, people would pay fortunes for eco-toilets and off-grid living workshops, rediscovering what every winter camp had known all along, that sanitation is not a luxury, it's survival choreography. And beyond those snow-covered pits and ash-lined systems, something even more ingenious waited a way to stay clean, warm, and spiritually aligned without needing a river or a soap bar. A solution that involved rocks, steam, and a small, smoky dome glowing like a heartbeat under the snow. When the rivers froze and snow sealed every path, people turned inward, not just toward fire, but toward heat made holy. The sweat lodge was winter's bathroom, church, and clinic rolled into one. A low dome of bent willow poles, covered with hides or bark, dark as the inside of a drum, built small on purpose so the body could remember humility. Outside, the world was deathly still. Inside, the air pulsed with the hiss of hot stones. No plumbing, no soap, just volcanic therapy before volcanoes were fashionable. Rocks were heated in open fires until they glowed red, then carried in with forked sticks and laid in a pit at the lodge's center. Water was poured onto them to release steam so dense it felt alive. People sat in a circle, sweat rolling down skin until it met the earth again. There was no word for detox. The body simply participated in the same process as everything else in nature. Condensation, evaporation, renewal. It wasn't mystical. It was thermodynamics, with better storytelling. Different nations practiced their own versions. Lakota Inipi, Ojibwe Inuit steam pits dug into the frozen ground, Iroquoian bark lodges heated by stone. Archaeologists still find scorched stones near ancient winter sites, and every time they do, someone inevitably writes a paper about ritual purification. Yes, ritual, but also hygiene. Because if you've spent weeks in a sealed shelter eating smoked meat and breathing other people's opinions, ritual steam is less about symbolism and more about odor management. The lodge served body and spirit simultaneously. Sweat, flushed out grime, smoke, and the faint regret of existing through another February. The air smelled of cedar, sage, and survival. People prayed, sang, or sat in silence, each breath measured against the rhythm of dripping condensation. Then came the cold part, stepping out half-naked into air so sharp it could cut glass, plunging into snow or a hole in the ice, and letting the shock reset everything from circulation to existential dread. The modern spa calls this contrast therapy. For them, it was simply the way to keep living in balance with a world determined to freeze you solid. Inside, the experience was democratic. Chiefs sweated beside hunters, grandmothers beside adolescents. No hierarchy survived in 110 degrees of steam. The only thing that mattered was endurance, and the shared belief that cleanliness, like balance, had to be maintained through effort and humility. You didn't emerge from the lodge perfumed or pampered. You came out blinking, gasping, and cleaner in ways that had nothing to do with soap. When the steam finally cleared and the fire outside hissed low, people rested, wrapped in hides, steam still rising off their skin like ghosts leaving in slow motion. The night was quiet, the snow faintly blue, and beneath that silence, the same stones waited to be reheated again and again, because the next stage of winter hygiene wasn't about sweat anymore. It was about ice water, nerves of steel, and a kind of bravery that modern thermostats will never understand. The logic was brutal but elegant. What the steam opened, the cold would seal. After sweating out every earthly impurity in a boiling hut the size of a pantry, people stepped outside into the kind of air that could make a priest reconsider creation. The plunge into snow, river, or ice hole wasn't an act of courage, it was maintenance, a physiological punctuation mark that reminded the body it was still on speaking terms with the environment. Among northern nations, Ojibwe, Cree, Lakota, Inuit, and others, the steam then ice routine was as reliable as sunrise. Bathing wasn't scheduled by comfort. It was timed by necessity and rhythm. Sweat, rinse, freeze, repeat. The body learned to cycle between worlds, the inferno of the lodge and the indifferent glacier outside. Some early European chroniclers watched this and decided it must be madness, which is rich coming from people who bathed quarterly and thought perfume was a medical treatment. The plunge wasn't theatrical, it was functional. It closed pores, improved circulation, and hardened resolve. Modern science has caught up centuries late, nodding sagely about immune response and vascular resilience. Indigenous people didn't need the vocabulary. They had the evidence: healthier skin, fewer infections, steadier spirits. The cold stripped away everything the sweat had dislodged, sealing the work like the final brushstroke on a painting no one would ever frame. Not all plunges were liquid. Sometimes it was snow, armfuls of it rubbed on skin until it hissed and melted, steam rising from the contact between human heat and frozen purity. Children learned early: cold cleans deeper than soap. Adults knew better. Cold also reminds you what pain feels like when it's honest. Some tribes rolled in snow laughing, others prayed softly through the shock. Either way, it ended the ritual in perfect symmetry: heat, release, sting, silence. And there was beauty in that absurd discipline. Picture it: the night sky, a dome of frost, breath turning silver, river black as obsidian, and a line of steaming bodies wading in with the casual indifference of people who've stopped negotiating with nature. You could hear hearts beating under the ice, not metaphorically, but literally, through the water's echo. When they climbed out, skin flushed and steaming, they weren't saints or masochists. They were simply aligned again with the rhythm of their land. Back inside, fires roared, hides wrapped tight, and laughter replaced shivering. The plunge wasn't a punishment for leaving the warm hut. It was proof that life continued outside it. Because after all, the world didn't care about your comfort. It cared about your participation. And just when the warmth returned, another ingenious trick waited, one that involved those same stones, now dry and glowing, pressed into the folds of bedding to keep body heat from slipping away into the eternal cold. Long before anyone plugged in an electric blanket, people were smuggling rocks into bed. Not just any rocks, carefully chosen, river-rounded stones that had spent an hour buried in coals until they glowed like small suns. Wrapped in bark or hides, they were tucked under sleeping platforms, near feet, or beside the ribs. A primitive space heater, yes, but also a hygiene tool disguised as a bedtime ritual. Because warmth did more than comfort the body. It dried the dampness that made filth thrive. Moisture was the real villain of winter living. Inside a lodge, condensation gathered on hides, breath thickened the air, and every exhale became a potential mold experiment. Heated stones solved that by pulling moisture from the bedding, evaporating sweat, and keeping everything less alive. A dry bed wasn't luxury, it was infection control. Somewhere between physics and faith, warmth became a form of cleanliness, the closest thing to sterilization available before boiling water or bleach existed. The method was delicate: too hot, and your heater burned through hide and reputation. Too cool, and you might as well hug a snowdrift. Elders taught the balance the way modern people teach thermostat etiquette, a cultural art form measured in degrees of survival. Children learned to roll the stones with sticks, never hands, and to thank them when their breath no longer steamed into the night. Gratitude for geology, it's a lost tradition. Archaeologists occasionally unearth scorched patches of earth inside old winter dwellings and labeled them domestic fires. They're half right. These were domestic defenses, where warmth itself became a weapon against cold and disease. Heated stones turned sleeping areas into miniature climates, dry, breathable, safe for skin and lungs. While Europeans were discovering that unventilated hearth smoke could kill them slowly, indigenous engineers were creating microventilation systems with nothing more than fire, air, and a rock with ambition. The same stones, sometimes double the After childbirth or illness, they were used to heat water for cleansing tools or bodies, the ancient version of disinfection. Even ashes from burned stones were mixed with water to scrub hides or absorb odor. It was a cyclical logic. What gave heat also preserved hygiene, and what preserved hygiene ensured the next night wouldn't end with pneumonia. A simple equation modern civilization forgot while designing scented candles, and the scene it's easy to picture. A circular lodge humming with low torque, fire fading to red, someone placing a warm stone beneath a blanket as if tucking in a small deity. Outside, the temperature could kill you. Inside, warmth felt earned, borrowed from the earth. It wasn't comfort for comfort's sake. It was participation in a system where everything that touched the skin also protected it. The stone slept too, cooling slowly through the hours, exhaling its last whisper of heat into the dawn. And when morning came, there was another lesson waiting. Not about warmth this time, but about what to wear when that warmth finally left. Because surviving the day meant dressing the body like a carefully ventilated machine, one that breathed, insulated, and, most importantly, stayed clean under layers of fur and frost. There's a myth that ancient people smelled like despair and wood smoke. In reality, many native communities were doing laundry long before soap had a marketing department. Clothing, especially in winter, wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about keeping dry, and by extension, alive. Sweat, trapped under fur or hide, was the enemy, not the cold itself. Because once moisture found its way between skin and fabric, frostbite wasn't far behind, and frostbite was basically the body's way of declaring bankruptcy. So winter wardrobes were strategic. The inner layer, usually soft tanned deerskin or rabbit fur worn inward, absorbed sweat. The outer layers were thicker hides, bark cloth, or furs turned outward to repel snow and wind. The genius was in rotation. Inner garments were swapped, aired out, or dried by the fire daily. This constant changing of layers kept bodies clean and reduced infections, odors, and that particular kind of damp misery that even shamans couldn't bless away. Early anthropologists peering into winter lodges were shocked by the number of neatly folded skins and spare moccasins. They called it primitive abundance. The people themselves called it not freezing to death. Unlike Europeans, who approached laundry as a twice-yearly religious event, indigenous families treated clothing care like breathing. Smoke from fires was used to tan, disinfect, and deodorize hides, an accidental form of dry cleaning long before the French gave it a name. The process left clothing infused with wood and sage, a scent that doubled as insect repellent and spiritual perfume. Travelers would step into other camps, smelling faintly of juniper and survival, which honestly beats anything from a modern department store. Every family had its small domestic choreography. One person brushed fur with bone tools to keep it soft. Another rotated moccasins, so no pair stayed damp long enough to grow anything adventurous. Children learned early that hanging your leggings too close to the fire meant waking up to what could only be described as crispy regrets. Fires didn't just heat, they sanitized. Ashes mixed with water made lye, and lye made cleansing possible. It was chemistry disguised as household wisdom. This wasn't vanity either. Clean clothing protected skin from sores and infections, which were deadly in the cold. A healthy layer of fur and dignity was worth more than gold. The irony, of course, is that centuries later, survivalists would rediscover layering and call it technical gear, unaware they were plagiarizing indigenous science with worse fashion sense. But the wardrobe wasn't the only secret to staying clean in the cold. For all the care given to furs and skins, water itself was treated like a precious ally, collected, melted, rationed, and repurposed for everything from drinking to washing to spiritual renewal. And the way it was handled, the logistics of making water behave in a world determined to freeze it solid, was its own kind of brilliance. In winter, water was everywhere and nowhere. You could walk on it, stare at it, die in it, but you couldn't pour it into a bowl without starting a small engineering project. Yet even when rivers locked under ice, indigenous families kept water moving. The secret wasn't force. It was patience, fire, and the occasional redefinition of what counted as clean enough. Snow was the obvious solution. But snow is mostly air, fluffy, treacherous air. A pot full of it yielded a miserly sip once melted. So the trick was compression, packing it tight with gloved hands or bark scoops until a single potful could quench a family. Stones were heated, dropped into the snow to speed the melt, and the result strained through woven grass mats to remove ash or stray needles. The process was slow, meditative, and if you've ever watched ice turn to steam, oddly theatrical, like conjuring liquid from ghosts. For washing, water was rarely boiling hot. It only needed to be warm enough to stay liquid longer than the person using it. Birch bark containers, clay pots, or hollowed wood troughs served as basins. A handful of spruce needles or ash gave it a mild alkalinity, nature's soap. If you didn't mind the smell of campfire and discipline, the same heated stones that warmed beds doubled as immersion heaters. Drop one in and you'd get an instant bubble of hiss and vapor, proof that science occasionally feels like magic when you're freezing. The real artistry lay in storage. Ice was carved into blocks and stacked near lodges, covered with moss and snow, forming primitive freezers that kept water safe from contamination. In some regions, hollowed tree trunks lined with hide became cisterns. Elsewhere, water skins were sealed and hung upside down from lodge poles, the thawed portion dripping into bowls as the day warmed. Not a drop wasted. Not a single overcomplicated mechanism in sight. Settlers who stumbled upon these methods often wrote about them with equal parts awe and condescension. One fur trader described savages melting snow as if it were a craft. He never noticed that his own camp, lacking that same craft, was dehydrating quietly beside a full river they couldn't break through. The irony was almost poetic, dying of thirst while surrounded by water too solid for their imagination. The cultural logic behind it was practical and spiritual. Water was alive, and to misuse it invited imbalance. Melting snow indoors wasn't just convenience, it was cooperation. You shared breath with the element, coaxed it back to motion. That kind of intimacy leaves traces. Every drop mattered because every drop had to be earned. And once the water was there, lukewarm, faintly smoky, and tasting of survival, it didn't go to waste. It bathed faces, washed hands, rinsed hides, and occasionally doubled as tea water, because efficiency was a virtue when everything froze again by morning. It's easy to romanticize, harder to imagine. Hygiene measured by firewood and patience. And from that steaming pot came another ritual, the quiet art of caring for the skin itself, that fragile barrier between life and the cold. Oils, fats, and smokes turned dryness into resilience, and winter faces gleamed, not from vanity, but from an ancient chemistry of survival. When the wind burns harder than the fire heals, survival becomes a matter of oil. Not the perfumed kind that promises youth, but the kind that smells faintly of smoke, meat, and practicality. Indigenous communities across the continent, Cree, Ojibwe, Inuit, Dene, Lakota, treated skin not as vanity's canvas, but as winter's armor. Without its care, the face cracked, the hands bled, and the wind ate you slowly from the outside in. Animal fats were the first line of defense. Rendered from bear, seal, or deer, they were rubbed into exposed skin like invisible fur. It trapped warmth, blocked wind, and left a soft sheen that explorers misread as grease. Those same explorers, meanwhile, were freezing their noses off under powdered wigs, wondering why the locals looked so annoyingly healthy. Some even recorded that the savages' faces glowed as if from fever. It wasn't fever. It was moisturization done right. Hair, too, had its rituals. It was washed rarely but cared for, constantly combed with bone or porcupine quills to remove soot and tangles, then treated with animal oil or melted marrow. The result was strong, glossy hair that resisted frost and smoke. Women braided it tight to prevent tangling during sleep. Men greased it for protection in wind and war alike. No one mistook this for decoration. It was functional insulation, beauty by accident. Plant extracts added fragrance and medicine. Spruce gum softened the skin. Juniper and sweetgrass scented hair. Even the act of rubbing these substances in served a physiological purpose, stimulating circulation when the cold wanted to stop it altogether. You could call it skincare, though it was really survival massage with theological overtones. Because in most traditions, the body wasn't separate from the sacred, it was its most exposed frontier. The cold punished anything left unguarded. Lips split open, eyelids chafed, cheeks froze into mask-like stiffness. Fats prevented that, but they also held ritual value. Greasing the body before a hunt or journey wasn't just practical, it was a silent pact with the elements. I respect you, please don't kill me today. In Arctic cultures, rubbing oil on a visitor's skin could even be a form of hospitality in intimate, pragmatic blessing disguised as grooming. It's the kind of tradition that would horrify modern dermatologists until they saw the results. Modern creams try to imitate what a few ounces of seal oil perfected centuries ago. The old ways didn't need branding. They needed endurance. And endurance had its own perfume, a blend of smoke, fat, and snow. Inside lodges, the air smelled of burning spruce, sweat, and faint animal musk. Outside, the skin steamed faintly where oil met cold, a private alchemy that turned frostbite into aroma. In that sense, cleanliness was never sterile. It was warm, alive, and faintly oily. And just beneath those layers of greased skin and fur-lined leggings lay the part of the body that risked the most feat, the daily hostages of ice and motion. Their care was a ritual of its own, half medical, half devotional, performed each night beside the fire where warmth met exhaustion. The human foot was never designed for negotiations with snow. Every winter journey was a conversation with pain, and every return to camp a small medical operation. Among northern tribes, feet weren't ignored appendages. They were frontline soldiers, washed, dried, inspected, and pampered with the intensity of something sacred. Because once frostbite set in, no prayer, chant, or charm could argue with it. Moccasins were masterpieces of logic. Softened leather, lined with fur or dry grass, kept feet insulated yet breathable. Unlike rigid European boots, they allowed circulation. Blood could move, and so could feeling. After long treks they were removed immediately, dried near the fire, and stuffed with warmed grasses or ashes to pull out moisture. It wasn't luxury, it was triage. The line between toasty and gangrenous was about 10 minutes and one inattentive campfire away. Washing wasn't constant, but it was strategic. Melted snow or warm water was used sparingly to rinse salt, grime, and trapped sweat. Then came the fat bear grease, tallow, sometimes fish oil rubbed into heels and toes to prevent cracking. The smell was appalling and the results miraculous. One early fur trader wrote that the natives coat their feet in lard, as if preparing them for baking. He wasn't entirely wrong. The only thing baked was his own dignity when his toes turned black before spring. In the Arctic, Inuit and Yupik hunters developed techniques that border on genius. They alternated pairs of inner boots made of fur worn inward, swapping them out during long travel, while one pair dried by body heat or fire. The other was worn, an early version of moisture management that would make modern mountaineers weep with envy, and when drying wasn't possible, they simply kept moving. Stagnation was the real killer, not the cold itself. Children were taught early, never sleep with cold feet. Warm stones or hands were used to revive them before bed, a nightly inspection disguised as tenderness. Parents massaged toes, not out of sentimentality but survival, stimulating blood flow, checking for stiffness, for color that didn't return. It was family affection as preventive medicine. Hands received the same care. Hunters returning from icy rivers rubbed them with tallow, flexed them before the fire, then plunged them briefly into snow, a shock that improved circulation and toughened the skin. The cold wasn't an enemy, it was a sparring partner, and the body had to stay ready to meet it halfway. The irony, centuries later, survival manuals would rediscover these methods, presenting them as cutting-edge field medicine, as if the people who'd lived through 10,000 winters needed tips from a paperback. The original wisdom was quieter, simpler, and infinitely harder to market. Keep your blood moving, your skin greased, your moccasins dry, and your pride nowhere near your toes. By night, when the wind howled through the cracks of bark and hide, families sat cross-legged, cleaning, rubbing, and checking one another's limbs. It wasn't just hygiene, it was care disguised as routine. In those small gestures lived the understanding that survival wasn't solitary, it was communal, a nightly audit of each other's warmth. And once the limbs were safe, once the feet thawed and the fireside low, the body could finally surrender to sleep. But even sleep had rules, rituals of quiet washing, small gestures of cleansing that separated the day's labor from the long frozen night. By nightfall, winter camps settled into a soft rhythm, fires popping, snow sighing outside, and everyone performing the same understated ceremony of survival, cleaning themselves, just enough to face another day without falling apart. There was no toothbrush, no lavender soap, no luxury, just bowls of tepid water, handfuls of ash, and the same unspoken rule that civilization begins where filth ends. Evening hygiene wasn't about comfort, it was strategy. Hands were washed first always, hands because everything passed through them. Meat, tools, smoke, other people's hands. A mixture of ash and melted snow worked as mild lye, dissolving grease and disinfecting without wasting precious fat. The smell wasn't floral. It was honest, a blend of smoke, sweat, and the faint sweetness of relief. Faces came next, wiped with warmed cloths or strips of bark softened in water. The goal was to remove soot, the day's salt, and any evidence that you'd been alive in sub-zero temperatures for 14 straight hours. Feet, as always, got special attention. They were warmed, checked, and rubbed with oil until pliant again. The act bordered on reverence. Children giggled through the process. Elders sat still, eyes half closed, faces lit by the fire. In some regions, like the subarctic Cree and Dean, a quick smoke bath followed a handful of spruce needles thrown on coals, the aromatic smoke drawn across the skin like invisible soap. It didn't just cleanse. It reset the senses, clearing out the day's heaviness. Modern spas would call it aromatherapy. They'd also ruin it by charging admission. Inside lodges, cleanliness was a collective habit. Ashes were swept from hearths, bedding shaken and aired, hides turned so that the dry side faced in. Someone always tended the fire. Too much smoke, and the lungs paid for it. Too little, and the frost took the night. Hygiene and ventilation were the same thing. One careless ember, one night of neglect, and a lodge could turn from sanctuary to tomb. The last ritual was silence. Once everyone settled, talk dwindled to murmurs. The body's noises, breathing, crackling joints, the soft shuffle of someone shifting under fur were all that remained. It was a kind of communal meditation born from exhaustion and mutual respect for the fragile balance that kept the air inside warm and the cold outside indifferent. In that darkness, even cleanliness took on a moral weight. To care for the body was to thank it for surviving another day in a world that didn't owe you warmth. There was something almost sacred in the simplicity. Water, fire, oil, breath, no more, no less. And as the last spark dimmed, you could almost feel the camp exhaler shared sigh between bodies that had cleaned, fed, and forgiven themselves for existing in a climate designed to erase them. Yet even this quiet hygiene had its communal echo. Beyond the private routines, winter brought group cleansing, whole families and villages stepping together into heat and smoke to purge not just dirt but tension, stagnation, and spiritual fatigue. The bath turned social, the steam turned sacred, and in the heart of winter, even cleanliness became a kind of prayer. In the deep quiet of midwinter, when the world outside froze into sculpture, warmth became communal, not just for survival, but for sanity. Families and neighbors gathered to sweat, pray, and occasionally gossip inside low domes of steam, a blend of hygiene, therapy, and social event that would have baffled any missionary with a bar of soap. The sweat lodge wasn't just where dirt went to die, it was where the village recalibrated itself. Imagine it, snow piled outside, breath hanging in the air, and half the community crammed into a small, steaming space that smelled of cedar, flesh, and resolve. It was noisy, singing, chanting, laughter that bordered on delirium, but beneath it ran a shared understanding that this wasn't recreation, it was repair. After weeks of confinement, smoke, and cold, the human body needed more than heat, it needed release, and this collective sweating, this synchronized purification, was the closest thing to rebirth available without paperwork. The structure itself was temporary, a deliberate gesture against permanence. Willow branches bent into domes, covered with hides or bark, rebuilt each season like an exhale from the earth. Inside, glowing stones hissed under water poured by a designated attendant, often an elder who knew exactly how to balance pain with endurance. Too much heat, and people fainted. Too little, and the gods got bored. Somewhere between both extremes lay health. Communal cleansing carried layers of meaning. It strengthened bodies, yes, but it also aired out grievances. During the sweat, songs were sung not just for ancestors but for patience, with relatives, neighbors, and oneself. The heat stripped away modesty and social rank. Chiefs sweated beside hunters, mothers beside daughters, all equal, all human, all briefly clean. There was an unspoken law that what was said inside stayed there, a confidentiality agreement enforced by steam and decency. European observers, naturally, misunderstood the whole affair. To them, the lodge looked suspiciously like a sauna with delusions of grandeur. They missed the point. The steam wasn't for comfort, it was for continuity. Illnesses were treated there, but so were insults. A good lodge session could end a feud or start a romance, depending on the ventilation. Cleanliness and catharsis shared the same temperature. For Arctic and subarctic peoples, group bathing had an even sharper edge. Heat was precious to generate it, for one person would be wasteful, so everyone joined. Families took turns, cycles of steam and cold. One group heating while another rested, until the entire camp glowed faintly with shared humidity. Hygiene became choreography, the fire its conductor. And when it was done, when the air cooled and the lodge lay dark and dripping, people emerged back into the snow, flushed, steaming, unified. You could see them breathing together, exhaling the same pale mist, as if the entire camp had inhaled, sweated, and exhaled as one body. But for all its warmth and togetherness, another, less glamorous side of winter hygiene still loomed. Clean skin and pure spirit were admirable, but even gods needed latrines. And in the middle of a frozen forest, sanitation required as much reverence as any prayer. For all the poetry surrounding snow, the truth is that winter sanitation was a logistical nightmare wrapped in frostbite. You could have the purest spiritual hygiene in the world, but one poorly placed latrine could still turn your camp into a frozen epidemiology lesson. Indigenous communities across the continent managed this with a combination of engineering, discipline, and the kind of collective common sense modern civilization tends to lose the minute it invents plumbing. The first rule was distance. Waste had a direction, always downwind, downhill, and far from food storage or water sources. Camps were designed with sanitation in mind. Sleeping areas, cooking fires, and latrines all had their proper geography. In snowbound conditions, waste pits were pre-dug before the ground froze solid, lined with bark or grass, and later sealed with ash. In Arctic regions, where the earth never thawed enough to dig, people used designated snow pits or carried waste away from camp entirely, often burning it under controlled fires. That's right, sustainable waste management existed centuries before the term eco-friendly started appearing on plastic packaging. Inside dwellings, cleanliness bordered on ritual. Ashes from hearth fires doubled as disinfectant, sprinkled over refuse, spilt liquids, or even animal leavings to neutralize odor and moisture. In some traditions, small ash bowls were kept near the fire, specifically for that purpose. The logic was simple. If it burns, it cleans. And the act of sprinkling ash after use carried a faint echo of ceremony, a quiet acknowledgement that every human act, even the least glamorous one, deserved a proper ending. Children were taught early that sanitation wasn't punishment, it was protection. No one was exempt from sweeping, airing hides, or clearing waste paths. Cleanliness was communal. If one person got lazy, everyone paid for it. The social enforcement of hygiene was fierce, not moralistic, just mathematical. One poorly placed midden could poison a river come spring. You didn't mess with the water, ever. European accounts, predictably, got this backwards. Early settlers accused indigenous camps of being dirty, then proceeded to dump their chamber pots out of fort windows. Meanwhile, they marveled, usually in footnotes, at the strange absence of odor in native encampments. Missing the connection entirely, cleanliness wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure. In the northern woodlands, people even used the snow itself as a cleaning medium. Yellowing drifts were covered or marked, not because of superstition, but because snow was also the community's bathwater. Everything froze fast, which meant everything could be controlled. Waste management wasn't glamorous, but it was genius, low impact, biodegradable, and perfectly adapted to a frozen ecosystem that recycled everything except excuses. At night, when the campfire glowed low and the wind sang through the trees, you could look around and notice how clean the world felt. No stench, no decay, no careless footprints near the cooking pit, just silence and snow, both sterile in their own way. But hygiene wasn't only about removing filth, it was about keeping illness at bay. Winter wasn't kind to lungs, skin, or stomachs, and survival meant transforming cleanliness into medicine long before there were words like immunity. Winter was a doctor with terrible bedside manners. Cough once, and the cold air answered back with pneumonia. Sleep in, smoke too long, and your lungs learned regret. Survival, therefore, was less about heroism and more about maintenance, keeping the body clean enough, dry enough, and balanced enough to outwit what modern textbooks politely call seasonal respiratory. complications. Indigenous medicine wasn't mystical in the way outsiders liked to describe it. It was empirical, learned from observation, repetition, and the occasional near-death experiment. Cleanliness was part of that science. Sweat lodges weren't just spiritual purifiers. They were ancient immune-boosting chambers. Heat opened the pores, expelled toxins, and killed bacteria long before anyone invented microscopes. Herbal smoke, sage, cedar, sweetgrass, disinfected air, tools, and skin. It smelled holy, but it worked like a chemical weapon against contagion. Inside lodges, where people lived shoulder to shoulder with family, dogs, and the occasional drying carcass, smoke was both curse and cure. It kept mosquitoes and mold at bay, dried hides, and sterilized the air in ways early colonists never understood. Europeans saw dirty soot-covered dwellings and missed the hidden logic. The smoke was medicine, not mess. It was the difference between a cozy house and a petri dish. Water, too, was rationed as carefully as food. Clean hands meant fewer infections from cuts and scrapes. Clean bedding meant fewer parasites. Even small rituals, like sprinkling ashes over refuse or airing furs, were public health policies disguised as domestic chores. Illness wasn't random. It was the visible face of imbalance, and hygiene was the daily negotiation that kept it at bay. Communities didn't separate the physical from the spiritual. Cleanliness protected both. When epidemics swept through later centuries, healers reminded people to cleanse their homes and their hearts. The advice was literal: scrub the floor, sweep the smoke holes, wash the body, confess the temper. The body was the first landscape you learned to keep in harmony. And harmony had measurable outcomes. Studies centuries later would note that indigenous groups with strong hygienic customs, frequent bathing, controlled waste management, and air purification through smoke had lower rates of skin and respiratory infections than their newly arrived neighbors. It's an awkward footnote in medical history. The so-called uncivilized were, statistically speaking, the clean ones. Preventing illness in winter was less about fear and more about rhythm. You kept the fire right, the air moving, the body sweating and drying in sequence. No hoarding of germs, no tolerance for laziness. If someone coughed, they weren't isolated. They were steamed, rubbed with fat, and wrapped in clean hides until balance returned. It was healthcare without the paperwork. And as winter dragged on, the air thick with breath and prayer, another form of cleansing took place, not just of bodies but of spaces. Fire and smoke were called to refresh the stale air of lodges, to chase away invisible sickness, and to make the air itself feel reborn. Because long before air purifiers and scented candles, people already knew how to clean the atmosphere with ritual, with fire, and with a respect for the unseen. To outsiders, winter lodges looked like suffocation chambers, thick smoke curling from a single hole in the roof, hides sealed tight, people huddled around a fire. It all seemed impossibly claustrophobic. But what looked like chaos was actually ventilation perfected by trial, error, and several centuries of learning how not to die of carbon monoxide. The same smoke that clouded the eyes also kept the lungs clean. It sterilized, deodorized, and, with a little luck, politely killed whatever wanted to breed in the corners. The air inside a winter dwelling was a living thing, heavy, fragrant, and thick with meaning. Firewood mattered, spruce for warmth, willow for slow burn, cedar and sage for cleansing. Some families mixed herbs or resins into the embers deliberately, perfuming the air while fumigating the space. It wasn't about fragrance, it was pest control. A few minutes of cedar smoke drove fleas, flies, and microbes out faster than any broom. And because smoke carried prayer as well as chemistry, every waft upward felt both practical and poetic. Hygiene with theology baked in. Steam joined the routine when moisture was needed. In harsh subarctic climates, air grew so dry, it cracked lips and lungs alike. People created microclimates by boiling snow or pouring water onto hot stones, rehydrating their homes and preventing the slow desiccation of winter life. It was rudimentary humidity management, perfectly effective and entirely unpatented. When explorers later brought bronchitis into the north, the locals already had a cure. Breathe near the pot, cough out the demons, repeat. The rhythm of smoke and steam was constant. Too much smoke and your eyes burned. Too little and the air went stale. So dwellings breathed like lungs. Inhale through the smoke hole, exhale through the door flap. The house itself was alive, sighing in sync with its inhabitants. And every few days, the fire pit was cleaned, ashes renewed, the roof smoke hole brushed free of soot, an act that was half housekeeping, half exorcism. There was irony here too. European visitors often complained that Indian lodges stank of smoke, then returned to their own cabins, reeking of damp mold and unwashed linen. They missed the secret. Smoke was the first disinfectant. Its heat dried the air, its chemicals killed bacteria, and its persistence ensured that nothing, not lice, not odor, not disease, lingered too long. When people say fresh air, they imagine something crisp and empty. For these winter dwellers, fresh air was earned, made by tending, burning, balancing. The purity didn't come from the absence of smoke, but from its mastery. And when the wind shifted and pulled that sweet blue haze up into the night, it carried with it more than soot. It carried survival itself, rising into the dark like a long, slow prayer to the gods of ventilation. But eventually, winter ended. The fires grew smaller, the smoke less necessary, and the season of cleansing gave way to one of migration and renewal. For every pot of melted snow, and every sweat-darkened hide, there came a final ritual, one last washing to greet the thaw, to close the chapter of endurance with a clean face and a lighter spirit. By the time the snow began to rot and drip from the eaves, winter's silence had worn thin. The air turned soft again, uncertain, carrying both thaw and the smell of everything that had patiently waited to decompose. It was the season of smell returning, not always kindly, and people met it the way they met every shift in the year, by washing, not for cleanliness as fashion, but for closure. Spring cleansing wasn't just a rinse, it was a ceremony of release. Water, finally liquid again, became sacred currency. Camps relocated closer to rivers and lakes, the first places to awaken from ice. Families stripped down to their sense of humor and took turns plunging into near-freezing water, emerging gasping and luminous. Laughter carried over the thawing plains like proof of resurrection. The same snow that had punished them all winter now forgave them, washing off months of smoke, oil, and discipline. Tools were clean too: knives, pots, moccasins, bedding. What couldn't be salvaged was burned, offered back to the land in smoke that smelled faintly of animal fat and relief. Dwellings were dismantled or aired, hides shaken, hearths scrubbed with fresh sand and ash. It was the opposite of hibernation, the shedding of every layer that had kept the world sterile and tight. The season demanded movement, and movement demanded purity. There was also the practical side. Thaw meant mud, and mud meant infection if one wasn't careful. So the same rituals that looked spiritual were also remarkably hygienic. Streams carried away waste. Ash was used to scour new cooking stones, and campsites were chosen with an eye for drainage rather than scenery. Cleanliness followed migration. Hygiene was mobility. Many nations marked the shift with fasting and purgation. The body that had survived on smoked meat and stored roots needed recalibration, so spring meant lighter foods, herbal teas, and sweat baths, intensified by the scent of new greenery. Illnesses that had hibernated in winter air were driven out by steam, song, and deliberate discomfort. The timeless logic that a little suffering in spring might spare you worse in summer. But there was joy too. Bathing in the open again felt like greeting an old friend, one who'd been absent but not forgotten. Children splashed, elders blessed the water, and the community, half laughing, half shivering, stepped out of winter's long confinement. The thaw wasn't just meteorological, it was emotional. Clean again, the body remembered softness, the spirit remembered noise. If winter taught restraint, spring restored appetite. Fires burned smaller, smoke drifted away, and the great machinery of life resumed its rhythm. Every basin, every pot, every sweat-darkened hide had done its work. Cleanliness had not been vanity or superstition, it had been the architecture of survival. And as the last of the snow melted into earth, leaving behind footprints, ashes, and memory, you could almost hear the land sigh, clean, alive, and ready to start the whole filthy, beautiful cycle again. It's funny how human beings never stop trying to be clean, even when the universe clearly isn't interested. Long before anyone invented scented foam or industrial bubbles, Cleanliness meant something closer to truce than triumph. Among the indigenous peoples of the northern lands, where the air itself could kill you for taking too long to think, hygiene was less about vanity and more about continuing to exist without rotting. Soap, in the modern sense, was irrelevant. Water froze. Fat belonged to the stew pot. Scent was a liability in hunting season. Yet cleanliness still mattered, because dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was imbalance. A greasy hand could spoil food, a filthy wound could end a lineage, and a foul smell was simply bad manners toward the spirits that shared your shelter. Clean didn't mean fragrant, it meant aligned. So people learned to make do with the simplest materials nature offered: ice, ash, and smoke, the cold, the burned, and the invisible. 3 ingredients that sound like a punishment, but behaved like salvation. Ice scrubbed, ash sterilized, smoke purified. Together, they formed an ecosystem of hygiene so effective it would take Western civilization a few centuries and several cholera epidemics to catch up. Inside winter lodges, routines had the rhythm of ritual. Melted snow served for washing faces and hands. Its chill, shocking but honest. Ash from the fire pit was rubbed between fingers to cut through grease, an ancient version of alkaline soap, though no one bothered to patent it. And smoke, that constant companion, drifted through hair, hides, and lungs, killing bacteria while anointing everything with the faint perfume of survival. There was no separation between cleanliness and cosmology. The same fire that cooked your food and kept you alive also kept you pure. The same snow that numbed your skin also scoured it. The same smoke that clouded your eyes also protected you from the invisible. Nature had provided all the disinfectants one could need, they just didn't come in bottles. It's tempting to romanticize it now, to imagine stoic beauty in the snow, people emerging from sweat lodges shining like myth. But the truth was closer to pragmatic genius than poetry. Hygiene wasn't optional. In close quarters, with animal hides curing and smoke thick enough to chew, filth wasn't quaint, it was fatal. Every act of cleaning was both ordinary and sacred. Scraping soot off your hands was no different from brushing away bad luck. Even the language reflected it. Words for clean often doubled as words for balanced or right. To be dirty was to be wrong, not morally, but existentially cleanliness was the thread keeping body and world stitched together. When explorers later described indigenous camps as surprisingly tidy, they weren't witnessing courtesy. They were glimpsing an entire philosophy disguised as household management. And so, soap was never the missing ingredient. What the rest of the world spent centuries trying to manufacture, these communities achieved with 3 states of matter and a refusal to die dirty: fire, air, and water. The chemistry of survival, disguised as housekeeping. And as the snow hardened outside and fires sank low, the logic deepened. When water fails you, ice takes its place. The cold itself becomes cleanser, scourge, and cure, a kind of frozen baptism that stripped away both grime and pride. When water betrayed you and turned solid, the sensible thing would have been to give up on bathing until spring. But human beings, particularly the kind stubborn enough to live in northern winters, didn't accept betrayal easily. So, when the rivers froze, they used the enemy itself. Ice became a cleaner, snow the only cloth. It wasn't masochism, it was logic. Snow is nature's coldest exfoliant, soft, sterile, and everywhere. After sweating in lodges or laboring over hides, people rubbed snow over skin until it squeaked. It pulled away oil, soot, and the memory of smoke. The shock was immediate, but so was the result. Blood rushed, pores closed, and skin glowed with the kind of radiance you only get from nearly dying of cleanliness. In the far north, snow baths weren't a novelty. They were punctuation. The Inuit Dean and others used packed snow as both towel and sanitizer, especially after steam baths or childbirth. Hunters rubbed snow on themselves before long trips, a reset for scent and temperature, a way to trick both body and prey. Clean meant invisible. A musky smell could announce you to a caribou long before your spear did. Snow was also safer than water in midwinter. Liquid froze instantly on skin, taking chunks of you with it. Snow, by contrast, melted gradually with friction. It was the difference between discomfort and injury. A handful of powder could clean a wound, chill a fever, or soothe a burn. The cold numbed pain, slowed bleeding, and discouraged infection. Centuries later, Doctors would discover ice baths and call it innovation. Even in lower latitudes, snow served as morning ritual. Children were tossed outside to roll in it for health, emerging shrieking and offended. It was both a lesson in endurance and a cure for idleness. Sweat, fear, and dirt, all frozen out of existence. The cold didn't kill, it clarified. It made you aware of every nerve that still worked, every heartbeat that hadn't quit. Cleanliness through ice carried a strange kind of humility. You learned to thank what hurt you, to trust this sting. Modern civilization sells comfort. These people cultivated precision. They didn't wait for the thaw to feel renewed. They made renewal happen, one snow handful at a time. European chroniclers, predictably, thought it barbaric. They watched native families scrub themselves in snow and wrote about wild superstitions of frost-borne cleansing. Then, they returned to their ships, unwashed and feverish, wondering why the savages never seemed to catch scurvy. It was more than hygiene. It was worldview. The cold wasn't something to flee from, it was something to collaborate with. The body wasn't above nature, it was part of its machinery. Ice, therefore, wasn't an obstacle. It was an instrument, as holy and practical as fire. And as those same fires crackled, another cleaner waited inside their ashes, a dull grey dust that could strip grease from skin and rot from meat, turning death itself into a form of purity. If snow was the cleanser of the body, ash was the cleanser of everything else. It was what remained when warmth had done its work and hunger had been fed. The ghost of fire, still useful after death. What most people saw as waste, others recognized as alchemy. Because hidden in that dull grey powder was the earliest form of soap humanity ever knew. Ash is lye in disguise, alkali born from burned wood and air. Mix it with fat and you get saponification, a chemistry experiment that indigenous peoples didn't need to name to understand. Sprinkled on greasy hides, it stripped away oil. Rubbed between fingers, it cut through the residue of meat and smoke. Dissolved in water, it disinfected wounds better than any European poultice of the time. It was also everywhere. Every fire produced it, and no camp went a night without fire. Which meant every family, by accident or intuition, possessed an endless supply of soap that never froze, never spoiled, and asked for nothing in return. Ash was the equalizer, the humble grey powder that cleaned tools, tanned skins, neutralized odors, and, with enough water, washed hair so thoroughly it squeaked. But beyond chemistry, ash carried symbolism that reached straight into cosmology. Fire consumed, ash renewed. It was the residue of transformation, matter reduced to purity. To cleanse with it was to borrow the fire's own judgment, to erase excess and begin again. When ash touched the skin, it reminded the body of its eventual fate. Everything burns, everything returns to dust. Cleanliness was a rehearsal for that truth. Women used it when preparing hides, rubbing ash into fur before scraping an act, both practical and ceremonial. Hunters used it to mask scent, brushing their arms and faces before setting out. Mothers sprinkled it in children's bedding to keep away insects, then swept it out in the morning as if sweeping out misfortune. It was cleanliness by subtraction, the removal of smell, grease, and spirit clutter all at once. Early settlers noticed the habit and mistook it for filth. They rubbed themselves in ashes, one wrote, like sinners seeking punishment, which, in a way, was true, though not in the way he meant. It wasn't penance, it was chemistry. The settlers, meanwhile, were still tossing their chamber pots into rivers and wondering why God hated them. The irony of it all was delicious. Modern civilization would one day rediscover lye soap, patent it, perfume it, and market it to the same kind of people who once called the original version barbaric, all while forgetting that its formula had been perfected centuries earlier by those who knew that cleanliness didn't come from comfort, it came from adaptation. Ash didn't foam, it didn't smell like lavender, it didn't need to. It worked because it was the memory of fire, the proof that even destruction leaves behind something useful. And as the last embers cooled, the air itself took over where ash left off, curling upward in blue-grey threads, carrying purification through smoke, the invisible cleanser that touched everything without ever being seen. If ash was the memory of fire, then smoke was its breath, a ghostly cleaner that reached where hands couldn't. In the great frozen months, it threaded through everything, hair, hides, tools, lungs. It was constant, inescapable, and absolutely essential. To outsiders, The air inside a winter lodge looked unbearable, heavy, dim, and choking. But to the people who lived there, that haze was both shield and medicine. Smoke kept them alive in ways no one could see. It worked like a natural fumigator. The aromatic woods, cedar, juniper, sage, sweetgrass, didn't just smell good. They killed microbes, drove off insects, and dried out the damp. A lodge without smoke grew mold. A camp without it stank. So families burned slowly, constantly, carefully. The hearth was never just for warmth. It was the community's immune system. Clothing, bedding, and furs were hung above the fire until they absorbed the scent, an invisible armor against rot and pests. Even meat and fish were cleaned by smoke, the heat driving out moisture and sealing the surface in a sterile kiss. In one motion, it preserved food, purified air, and sanctified the home. It was housekeeping disguised as theology. And of course, it carried meaning. The act of waving smoke over the body, over tools, over children, over guests, was both hygiene and prayer. The cedar wasn't only burning, it was interceding. Its rising tendrils scrubbed the invisible, where bacteria and bad luck were equally unwelcome. Every culture that burned herbs learned this truth. Sometimes cleanliness means transforming the air itself. Missionaries didn't like that part. They called the habit superstition, writing pious letters about how the savages worshipped the smoke. Meanwhile, their own congregations were dying of typhus in poorly ventilated churches. It's an old pattern, misunderstanding survival, because it doesn't smell European enough. The irony is that modern science eventually caught up and gave it Latin names. Volatile oils, antibacterial compounds, airborne phenolics. Laboratories confirmed what any elder could have told you centuries ago. A little cedar smoke in the lungs beats a doctor with no sense of humor. It's hard not to see poetry in it. The same air that blackened walls also purified them. The same smoke that blurred vision also preserved life. It was contradiction made domestic, a soft smoldering veil between the living and decay. Even its smell carried reassurance. Step into a smoked lodge, and you'd know immediately that people were alive inside, not just surviving, but maintaining order against the entropy of winter. And when the smoke cleared, or, more accurately, shifted, it revealed the oldest bath in the world, a low dome filled with heat, steam, and songs. The kind of place where people didn't just clean the skin, but stripped the soul down to something honest. When soap was a fantasy and bathing in rivers meant suicide by frostbite, people turned inward literally. The sweat lodge was winter's loophole, a way to boil the body without touching a drop of running water. From the outside it looked like a half-buried hut, barely big enough for regret. From the inside, it was a chemistry lab for the soul. The setup was almost embarrassingly simple. Stones heated in the fire until they glowed, then carried inside and dropped into a pit. Water poured over them, erupted into clouds, so thick you could taste them. In minutes, the world shrank to heartbeat, breath, and steam. There was no soap, no scrubbing, no perfume. Cleanliness happened by persuasion pores opening, sweat purging, lungs surrendering everything they'd collected since the last ceremony. It wasn't superstition, it was physics. Heat kills bacteria, steam softens skin, sweat expels toxins and unclogs everything civilization keeps bottled up. The people who built these small, smoky sanctuaries didn't need to call it detox. They lived close enough to nature to know how to sweat with purpose. The Lakota called theirs inipi, to live again. The Ojibwe spoke of purification. The Inuit built their version right into the earth itself, letting the frozen soil trap warmth like a patient accomplice. Inside, the air shimmered with more than heat. It carried song, prayer, and the smell of cedar poured on the stones. The lodge became a body within a body, breathing, sweating, exhaling. By the time people crawled out shivering, half-blind, steam rising off their skin, they weren't just clean. They were recalibrated. To outsiders, it must have looked theatrical. Europeans wrote about savage sweat huts as though they'd stumbled upon a cult of masochistic bathers. They missed the point entirely. The lodge wasn't a luxury, it was plumbing. It was medicine, hygiene, and confession booth in one breathless structure. Where the modern world sees self-care, they saw survival, daily maintenance of both body and cosmology. And the experience wasn't quiet. Laughter mingled with chanting. Children were hushed, not from severity, but to respect the sound of the stones hissing like living things. You left behind everything: unnecessary grime, bad temper, maybe even arrogance. Clean wasn't sterile, it was lighter. The world outside was still cold, still indifferent, but for a while, the heat made sense of it. Afterward came the plunger snow, ice, river, whatever form of insanity the climate provided. The body, already glowing from within, met the cold like a forge meeting water. Skin tightened, blood roared, and the mind emptied into silence. It was the oldest contrast therapy on Earth: heat and ice, breath and shock, death and renewal. The modern spa industry is still plagiarizing it, minus the sincerity. And once the sweating and shivering ended, something quieter took over. People sat by the fire again, hair steaming, skin clean in that ancient way that feels earned, not scented. No soap, no suds, just the satisfaction of a body reminded of its own systems. And when the fire cooled, the tools of cleansing changed again. Not heat this time, but friction. No bubbles, only bark, sand, and stone, simple, silent instruments that polished both hides and humans with the same unpretentious precision. When water was rare, steam was precious, and soap was a rumor. People turned to texture. Cleanliness wasn't something you poured, it was something you scraped. Bark, sand, cattail fibers, smooth stones, and cured hides all had their turn as the world's first exfoliants. No perfumed foam, no miracle lotions, just friction and faith. After the lodge or the plunge, skin was rubbed with whatever the land offered. Fine sand along riverbanks polished away dirt. Strips of tanned hide absorbed sweat and oil like primitive towels. In regions rich with cattails or reeds, people bound handfuls together into soft brushes. Bark shavings, especially from birch, acted like the planet's first loofah, fragrant, biodegradable, and mildly abrasive. Archaeologists would later call these domestic tools. They were also, incidentally, the reason nobody died of mildew. This method of cleaning wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. Without soap, friction became chemistry. Heat and rubbing dislodged grime, and natural oils redistributed across the skin, sealing it against wind and cold. You didn't so much remove dirt as rearrange it into obedience. Skin emerged, not squeaky, but resilient, clean enough to survive the day, supple enough to face the next storm. In many communities, this small ritual of rubbing turned communal. Two people brushing each other's backs with sand or hide wasn't scandalous. It was affection through maintenance. Children learned how to clean elders, and elders taught the right pressure, the right rhythm. Knowledge passed down like a song. Cleanliness became choreography, slow, circular, unhurried. The genius of it all lay in portability. You could carry your hygiene in your hands. No dependence on hot water or stored fat. No waste, no plastic. The landscape itself was your bathroom cabinet, and it never ran out of supplies. The same stones that sharpened knives polished skin. The same sand that smoothed hides smoothed the body. Everything recycled, everything reabsorbed. Early explorers were baffled. They scrubbed themselves with dirt to remove dirt. One wrote, clearly defeated by logic. What he didn't grasp was that cleanliness wasn't about removing matter, it was about balancing it. The skin didn't need to be sterile. It needed to breathe, and the land knew how to assist. Even hair had its own regimen. Fine sand was combed through to absorb oil, then brushed out with carved bone or fish spine combs. Smoke and sunlight finished the job. The result: clean, shining hair with a faint scent of cedar and perseverance. Every act was efficient, circular, almost elegant in its simplicity. Clean didn't require invention, it required observation. And in that silence between strokes of bark and handfuls of sand, there lingered something sacred. The knowledge that the world itself provided every texture a human body could need. And when the rubbing was done, when the last grains of sand slipped away, came the finishing touch, the sealant that turned skin into armor. Oil, fat, and smoke blended into a protective sheen. Clean wasn't the absence of dirt anymore, it was the presence of defense. After the rubbing came the shining. The final stage of cleanliness was also the strangest. Covering yourself in the very thing the modern world tries hardest to remove: grease, animal fat, fish oil, marrow, or plant resin, if the season allowed. Rubbed into skin until it glowed. The result wasn't vanity, it was physics. Oil sealed moisture, repelled cold, and turned flesh into weatherproof material. Humans became their own survival gear. Bear fat was prized, thick, odorless when rendered correctly, and resistant to rancidity. In Arctic regions, seal or whale oil was essential. It soaked into skin like second breath. Further south, mixtures of tallow, pine, resin, and herbs served the same purpose. The application was almost ceremonial. Hands worked in slow circles, massaging warmth and protection into the body. What modernity calls skincare was, for them, sacred maintenance. It worked astonishingly well. Fat replaced soap's slick texture, but instead of stripping natural oils, it redistributed them. It sealed pores against windburn and snow glare, prevented frostbite, and kept insects at bay during the rare warm spell. Smoke from fires added another layer of defense, thin, tarry, antibacterial. Skin smoked and oiled this way didn't crack or fester. It endured. To outsiders, of course, it was unseemly. Europeans wrote of glistening savages, confusing health for filth. They mistook sheen for dirt, forgetting their own powdered wigs and unwashed stockings. Yet, centuries later, chemistry would prove what instinct already knew. Those layers of fat formed a natural antimicrobial barrier, far superior to the perfumes and powders of polite society. The logic ran deeper than biology. Fat wasn't just protection from weather, it was protection from chaos. To cover yourself in it was to claim partnership with the animal that gave it. Each application carried memory, gratitude, and an understanding of reciprocity. What fed the body also guarded it. Hunters, before leaving for days in the cold, would anoint themselves with oil as quietly as prayer. To be oily was to be safe from cold, from spirits, from the hunger of the land. Some oils were perfumed with smoke. Clothes hung above fires absorbed it too, creating a communal scent, part fat, part cedar, part continuity. The smell was unmistakable, dense, musky, and oddly comforting. It meant warmth, food, and company. In winter, the entire camp smelled alive. Children were greased nightly, their faces and hands shining in the firelight. Elders had their joints rubbed, bones sighing under the warmth. Even tools received a share. Oil on wood kept it supple, prevented cracking. Cleanliness in this sense wasn't sterility, it was preservation. Everything that could decay was taught to resist. The body, now coated and resilient, moved through smoke that both dried and sanctified it. The lodge itself exhaled purification, every surface brushed by fire's breath. And as the flames whispered upward, the next lesson unfolded in the air. How fire cleans not just bodies, but entire homes. The fire never stopped working. Even when the cooking was done and the bodies were fed, it went on cleaning what couldn't be seen. Every flicker, every exhale of smoke, was housekeeping on a cosmic scale. The hearth was a disinfectant, a deodorizer, and a therapist all in one. While the rest of the world struggled with drafty houses and disease-ridden air, these lodges mastered the art of purification by combustion. Inside, the air was alive, heavy with the scent of cedar, fat, and earth. It wasn't fresh in the modern sense, it was active. Fire consumed the damp, burned bacteria into memory, and kept rot from ever settling. Clothes and bedding hung near the smoke hole like supplicants in a temple, absorbing just enough scent to survive another day. If modern people had measured bacterial counts back then, they'd have written hymns to these chimneys. The rhythm of ventilation was deliberate. The fire pit at the center was low. The smoke hole above was small but perfectly placed. Warm air rose, drew in cold air from the edges, and circulated constantly. The lodge breathed. Even the angle of bark panels or hides mattered. Too tight, and people choked. Too loose, and heat escaped. Architecture was hygiene, disguised as intuition. Ashes, swept daily, served as floor cleaner and odor eater. When sprinkled over refuse or spilled fat, they neutralized smell and bacteria alike. Every few days, the hearth was scraped bare, a new bed of coals laid. The old ash went outside, repurposed as cleaner, pest repellent, or offering to the ground. There were no trash piles, no waste heaps, just cycles of burning and renewal. Fire also sanitized tools and utensils. A blade held briefly in the flames, a pot smoked over embers, a basket turned upside down above coals, until the air coming through it smelled like nothing at all. Every gesture, small but systematic. The invisible was kept in check by routine, and if someone died, the cleansing became literal ceremony. Fires were rekindled, smoke passed through the home, possessions aired, space purified. The logic was the same. Death invited decay, and decay invited disease. Fire ended both. Missionaries, stepping into these smoky homes, wrote about unbearable stench and eyes stinging with corruption. They failed to notice they weren't coughing from filth, they were coughing from sterilization. The same antiseptic mist that preserved food and dried hides was now burning their uninitiated lungs. A clean house, to them, simply smelled too alive. In the evenings, when the fires settled to a quiet glow and people lay wrapped in furs, the air turned soft again. Smoke drifted lazily upward, painting the ceiling blacker each night. That soot, too, was protection ceiling cracks, insulating walls, darkening light to calm the eyes. Even imperfection had purpose. And yet, for all the fire's power, its cleanliness had limits. The air could be pure, but the mind, restless from winter, still needed balance. Clean hands and clean lungs meant little without clean hearts, which is why the next form of purification wasn't physical at all. It was moral, social, a cleansing of behavior as carefully maintained as the fire itself. Cleanliness didn't stop at the skin. In most winter camps, purity stretched into behavior, manners, and thought hygiene as ethics. You could sweep your hearth spotless, but if you gossiped too much or disrespected an elder, you were still filthy. The body could shine while the spirit stank, so people washed both. Every small rule of daily conduct, when to speak, where to sit, how to share, was part of the same sanitation system that kept the community from decaying faster than its food supply. The line between health and harmony was so thin, it might as well have been smoke. A clean dwelling wasn't only a sign of order, it was a form of prayer. Ash in the corners meant the fire had done its duty. Quiet children meant no arguments had soured the air. Even laughter had to be balanced. Too much could disturb the house spirits. Too little meant sickness was near. Purity wasn't abstract, it was measurable. Food rituals, cleansing ceremonies, even the order in which people entered the lodgel were hygiene protocols. Wearing symbolic clothing. Before eating, hands were wiped with ash or snow. Before sleeping, breath was offered to the fire. After illness, both the body and the space it had touched were smoked clean. The idea was simple. Nothing unbalanced should linger. This form of moral hygiene wasn't prudish. It was preventative. Ill will, they believed, spread like contagion. Anger could make meat spoil. Envy could sour milk, and a careless word could attract spirits more persistent than bacteria. So every gesture of purifications, moke bath, fast, quiet, retreat worked as both antibiotic and diplomacy. Colonial observers, naturally, misunderstood. They saw people avoiding conflict and called them docile. They witnessed daily cleaning and labeled it ritual obsession. Meanwhile, their own settlements reeked of waste, plague, and politics. Civilization, it seemed, was excellent at separating cleanliness from decency. These so-called primitive societies refused abuse. For them, hygiene was the architecture of peace. Even taboos about blood, death, or childbirth followed the same logic. Cleanliness wasn't about shemet, was containment. Blood and decay were powerful, unstable elements, demanding respect. People who handled them cleansed themselves, not from guilt, but from contact with forces that blurred life's boundaries. The soap was symbolic, but the consequences were real. A balanced camp smelled right, sounded right, felt right. The air was light, conversation easy, food sweet. When imbalance crept in, you could sense it. Tension, bad dreams, sudden sickness. Then came smoke, fasting, or solitude until things evened out. The body was a mirror of the community. Keeping one clean meant preserving the other. Purity, then, wasn't a condition. It was a practice, repeated daily, quietly, without applause. Each sweep of ash, each gesture of courtesy, kept chaos from breeding in the corners. And though nobody said it aloud, everyone knew. Once you stopped cleaning, physically or morally, winter got inside you. Still, even the cleanest societies couldn't scrub away irony. For all their refinement, for all their invisible chemistry and moral ventilation, the world would one day call them uncivilized. And yet, the numbers told another story. Fewer diseases, cleaner air, and a lifespan that outlasted many of the settlers who brought soap and forgot to bring sense. That contradiction of being spotless and misunderstood leads to the final truth of the matter. That what the world dismissed as primitive was, in fact, the most sophisticated balance ever achieved between body, nature, and decay. History has a habit of praising complexity and overlooking competence. For centuries, the word clean belonged to civilization, marble baths, perfumed oils, and imported soap that smelled like debt. Everything else was filed under primitive, yet the evidence refused to cooperate. The so-called savages, it turned out, were running the earliest functional public health systems on the continent, invisible, unsupervised, and astonishingly effective. No marble, no plumbing, no plague. They understood the body not as something to dominate, but to balance. Smoke disinfected, ash neutralized, ice purified. Each process fed the next, a perfect loop of destruction and renewal. Dirt wasn't evil, it was just misplaced matter, waiting to be put back in order. The cycle was efficient, ecological, and so elegant that future centuries would have to reinvent it under laboratory lighting just to feel modern again. Europeans carried barrels of soap across oceans and still died in droves from their own water. Indigenous families, armed with nothing more than snow, fire, and instinct, survived winters that would have wiped out entire expeditions. But textbooks, written by the ones with bubbles, called it luck. What they missed was the philosophy beneath the practice. Cleanliness wasn't conquest, it was conversation. Every act of washing, rubbing, or smoking was an agreement between the body and the land. You didn't sterilize nature, you cooperated with it. You didn't erase dirt, you negotiated with it. The world stayed habitable because people treated it as something that could get sick, too, and there was no ego in it. No one bragged about being hygienic. It was as ordinary as breathing, as necessary as firewood. The science of balance disguised itself as routine, like all good science does. Archaeologists today find few traces of these rituals, because true cleanliness leaves no evidence. No latrines overflowing, no waste pits leaching into water. Just ashes scattered, stones blackened, air sweetened by centuries of slow smoke. The land remained livable, precisely because people refused to drown it in their inventions. Modern sanitation, tiled, bleached, electric, is efficient, but lonely. It isolates hygiene from meaning. The old ways, by contrast, made cleaning a form of belonging. Fire, air, water, and body worked in concert, each one purifying the other. There's something unsettlingly advanced about that, a sophistication without machinery, maintained entirely by rhythm and respect. And perhaps that's why, when the last missionary finished taking notes and the first anthropologist began translating them back, what they found wasn't backwardness, it was continuity. A civilization so clean it never had to say so. The truth was simple, and that's why it escaped notice. If your air is smoked, your water frozen, your hands ashed, and your heart in balance, you're already cleaner than the world that came to civilize you. It's strange to think that for most of human history, bathing wasn't about feeling nice. Nobody cared if you smelled like mountain air or apricot oil. The goal wasn't freshness, it was permission. Cleanliness was a ritual password, the difference between belonging and contamination, between being allowed near the sacred fire and being politely exiled to the edge of camp. Across continents, the impulse was the same. Before touching the divine, you had to rinse off the human. Dirt wasn't just physical. It was moral, relational, and deeply suspicious. Anything out of place, blood on a hand, dust on an offering, grief lingering too long, was a breach in the invisible order that held everything together. Washing wasn't comfort. It was maintenance of the cosmos. In ancient Egypt, priests bathed 4 times a day in cold water drawn from sacred pools. Not because they enjoyed it, they didn't. The Nile was generous with crocodiles and short on warmth. But cleanliness was the price of proximity. You couldn't chant to the gods with last night's sweat clinging to your skin. Every droplet of water had to carry intention. Purity wasn't hygiene. It was diplomacy with eternity. Far away, in Vedic India, the same logic played out along the Ganges. Bathing wasn't recreation, it was negotiation. Water removed sign, balanced karma, and cooled the spiritual temperature. The river didn't care if you were muddy. It cared if you were unaligned. The act of submerging was less about the body and more about dissolving the ego, that noisy, unclean thing that kept pretending to be separate from everything else. Even cultures without convenient rivers found their way to the same conclusion. In desert rituals of the Near East, dust became a substitute for water, purification through absence. Among Arctic peoples, snow and smoke stood in for soap. The medium didn't matter. What mattered was that anything mediated between flesh and the invisible. Cleanliness was never about individual comfort, it was about compatibility. A dirty body couldn't safely host a clean spirit. The universe, according to everyone from Navajo healers to Japanese Shinto priests, was exquisitely sensitive to contamination. And the gods, being gods, were notorious germaphobes. You could approach them only if you'd scrubbed off the residue of mortality first. What we now call hygiene was once a system of cosmic etiquette. Every culture had its version of the same rule. Don't touch the sacred with yesterday's hands. Sometimes this meant bathing in cold water, sometimes fasting, or burning herbs, or cutting hair. Cleanliness was the outward form of inward readiness, the physical rehearsal of spiritual balance. It's easy to mock this now, from the comfort of hot showers and antibacterial foam. But there's an uncomfortable truth under the irony. They were right. A society that ties cleanliness to spirit tends to produce people who respect limits of the body, the earth, and their place in the sequence of things. Once bathing became a leisure activity, the ritual lost its weight. Soap replaced meaning. To be clean once meant to be trustworthy in your dealings, in your speech, in your energy. It meant you could approach others without bringing your chaos with you. A clean person didn't just smell acceptable, they restored order by existing. And yet, this kind of cleanliness wasn't permanent. It faded with every emotion, every contact, every passing mood, which is why the washing had to continue, endless, rhythmic, almost musical. The spirit, like the skin, collected residue, and just as the body returned daily to water, the soul required its own cleansing before it could bear the weight of contact again. Because cleanliness in its oldest form wasn't a habit. It was preparation, a reminder that the body was only ever the surface of something more demanding beneath it. To most ancient people, the body wasn't property, it was a container, a vessel on loan, temporarily inhabited by something that preferred silence to conversation. The body could host spirit, but only if it was properly maintained, and maintenance required cleanliness. Not the kind that sparkled under fluorescent light, but the kind that made you available to whatever moved through wind, water, or dream. Among the Pueblo, bathing before dawn was a spiritual obligation. Water wasn't just cooling the skin, it was greeting the world politely. To step into the day without washing was to arrive uninvited. The body carried residue from sleep, stray dreams, restless thoughts, fragments of yesterday's self. Morning water reset it, made it usable again. The point wasn't comfort, it was clarity. In Japan, Shinto purification rituals followed the same rhythm. The practice of misogi, washing in rivers or under waterfalls, wasn't an act of bravery, though it required plenty. It was about emptying the vessel. A dirty body blocked flow, a clean one conducted divinity. The water didn't just wash the skin, it recalibrated everything beneath it. Standing under freezing falls wasn't masochism, it was maintenance of circuitry. Even in places where water was scarce, people found their substitutes. In Mesoamerica, bathing with smoke and copal resin cleansed the body and opened space for spirit. The fumes, rising like thought, transformed the air into solvent. Among Arctic peoples, steam served the same role. Heat and sweat didn't just clean, they summoned. After the lodge, the person who emerged was not quite the same as the one who entered. The logic was universal. You couldn't carry spirit in a neglected container. Unwashed hands insulted the divine. Unpurified breath corrupted prayer. When Egyptians embalmed their dead, they weren't preserving beauty. They were preparing the body for another tenancy. Flesh had to be immaculate for immortality to move in. It was, in a way, the oldest form of hospitality. The spirit was the guest, the body, the host. And if the house wasn't swept, the guest refused to stay. That's why monks, shamans, and healers across cultures devoted so much energy to cleansing, fasting, bathing, breathing, abstaining. They were keeping the house ready. Modernity would later misunderstand this relationship entirely. It would trade reverence for control. The body became something to sculpt, to optimize, to advertise. Cleanliness turned into performance, stripped of ritual weight. The sacred guest had long since stopped visiting, and the host was too busy polishing the floor to notice. Still, traces of the old logic remain. The instinct to shower before a hard conversation, to wash hands before prayer, to change clothes after grief, all small echoes of the belief that the body must match the spirit's frequency before either can function properly. And in that older rhythm, the body was never private. Its cleanliness or corruption affected the whole community. One person's impurity could ripple outward, souring crops, upsetting weather, or insulting gods who were notoriously sensitive about smell. So rules emerged: who could enter a temple, who must bathe after childbirth, who needed smoke purification after touching death. To the modern eye, it looks neurotic, but to them, it was ecological. The body was not separate from the river, the air, or the hearth. To cleanse one was to maintain the others. The body was the smallest temple in a world built entirely of temples, all equally demanding in their upkeep. And so, before every prayer, every ceremony, every act that involved stepping even slightly closer to mystery, there came the same quiet ritual: wash, smoke, breathe, wait. Because before one could touch the sacred, one had to prove the vessel could hold it. And once the vessel was ready, it faced the next rule, perhaps the oldest of them all, that no unclean person, no matter how well-intentioned, could ever cross the threshold of the sacred space without purifying first. Before the divine could be approached, the dust of the world had to be shaken off. The rule was ancient and non-negotiable. You did not enter sacred space dirty. It wasn't about etiquette, it was about physics. Impurity disrupted frequency. The gods, wherever they resided, were believed to operate on cleaner wavelengths. Humans, meanwhile, were always crackling with static. Purification was how you tuned yourself back into reception. In ancient Greece, worshippers bathed before sacrifices, washing their hands and sprinkling water on the altar to create a shared state of readiness. The Romans formalized it, assigning entire priestly classes to maintain ritual hygiene. Temples had fountains for washing, not decoration. To appear before a deity unwashed was like showing up at a royal court covered in mud, an offense against cosmic hierarchy. In Egypt, priests shaved every hair from their bodies, bathed in cold water several times a day, and wore linen that had never been worn before. Their cleanliness wasn't aesthetic, it was mechanical. Hair trapped impurity, cloth held memory. The gods required neither. The priests, hairless and immaculate, were living instruments, calibrated, disinfected, and slightly terrified. Half a world away, Native American ceremonies began with smoke baths. Participants waved burning sage or cedar over their bodies, letting the rising smoke carry away what didn't belong. The logic was identical. Before entering the sacred, the self must be edited. The same pattern echoed in Japan's hare, where purification by water and words erased spiritual pollution before worship began. To step into a temple, a sweat lodge, a circle of stones, anywhere sacred, without cleansing, first was more than rude, it was dangerous. The boundary between the clean and unclean was volatile. Crossing it in the wrong state risked sickness, misfortune, or divine withdrawal. The gods didn't punish so much as recoil. Impurity was contagious, and so were its consequences. In societies where sacred and ordinary constantly overlapped, people became meticulous about transitions. Farmers washed before planting, hunters fasted before the chase, mourners purified before rejoining daily life. Life was a series of thresholds, and each demanded cleansing before crossing. There were practical benefits too, though few needed to name them. Washing reduced disease, fasting calmed the nerves, smoke sterilized air. But the point wasn't medicine, it was readiness. Cleanliness was permission to be present, to stand before the fire, the idol, the elder, the sky. You had to prove your alignment through ritual order. Modern minds tend to separate hygiene from holiness, as if soap and spirit occupied different shelves. But for the ancients, they were the same product, one physical, one invisible. A person who refused purification wasn't just unkempt, they were unsafe, unstable, a walking breach in the cosmic firewall. It's easy now to see the fear in it, the anxiety about contamination, the obsession with control. But beneath the caution lived a kind of grace. Purity wasn't about superiority, it was about participation. You cleansed not to be better, but to belong. And once inside, once the body was cool, the breath steady, the smoke faded, the clean met the cleaner. The human stood in front of the divine, trembling and freshly washed, and tried to make sense of it. But even outside the temples, away from the fires and the priests, there lingered another, subtler law. Cleanliness wasn't only required for the sacred, it was the definition of the sacred itself. Dirt wasn't filth, it was displacement. The world wasn't made of clean and dirty things. It was made of things that either belonged or didn't. In the ancient imagination, dirt wasn't the enemy. It was a reminder that things had slipped out of place. A little soil on the hands wasn't sin. It was geography. You'd touched what belonged somewhere else. Across civilizations, filth was simply matter on the wrong side of a boundary. A fish on land was sacred myth. Mud in the temple was pollution. Mary Douglas, writing much later, put it neatly: dirt is matter out of place. She could have been quoting a Babylonian priest. The logic was old. A cow's blood on the altar was holy. The same blood on the floor was defilement. Death in the house demanded cleansing, not because death was dirty, but because it was dislocated. It had crossed from its proper realm into yours. The ritual didn't erase it, it sent it home. To live cleanly, then, was to keep the map of existence tidy. Fire stayed in the hearth, water in its basin, words in their proper mouths. The cosmos was a filing system, and purity was good administration. The unclean weren't sinners. They were cosmic bureaucratic errors waiting to be corrected. That's why so many cleansing rituals looked less like bathing and more like accounting. You washed not because you felt grimy, but because something in the ledger had gone off balance. The Mesopotamians believed their gods took offense at misplaced substances: dust on an idol, mold on a brick, a human too close to a corpse. Purity laws in Leviticus followed the same logic: blood, skin, mildew, all examples of life behaving unpredictably, threatening order. The idea wasn't moral, it was spatial. Sacredness depended on containment. Once that was breached, chaos leaked through. A woman after childbirth wasn't impure because she had sinned, but because life had overflowed its boundary. The act of cleansing was a restoration, not a punishment. Even now, the language survives. We still say clean record, dirty money, muddy intentions. Dirt hasn't changed. Our metaphors just learned how to wear suits. The obsession with disinfecting everything from hands to reputations is a modern echo of an ancient anxiety that the world might slide back into. Disorder if we don't keep wiping it down. There was irony to the same substances considered unclean often played roles in purification. Mud healed wounds, blood sealed covenants. Smoke, born from burnt refuse, cleansed the air. The boundaries between pure and impure weren't moral walls but revolving doors. What cleansed in one context corrupted in another. The real danger wasn't dirt itself, but confusion about where things belonged. And so cleanliness became cartography. Every object, body, and gesture had a proper place. The priest in his precinct, the farmer in his field, the dead underground, the living above. Crossing lines demanded ritual not to apologize, but to keep the map legible. This way of seeing the world wasn't paranoid. It was precise. It treated existence like a fragile equation held together by placement. The gods didn't demand perfection, only order, and order required constant cleaning. But cleansing didn't always mean scrubbing away what was wrong. Sometimes it meant facing it: heat, sweat, blood, the substances most likely to stain. Because in some traditions, the path to purity led straight through the mess. For all their rules about purity, the ancients didn't flinch from the mess that made it possible. Cleanliness wasn't about removing filth, it was about mastering it. The world stayed pure not by hiding from blood and sweat, but by learning when to use them. The sacred didn't fear the body, it borrowed from it. Sweat was the most democratic form of cleansing. You could make it anywhere, without tools, without witnesses. In sweat lodges from the Arctic to the plains, steam became the bridge between muscle and divinity. The logic was simple: what came out of you was what didn't belong in you. People sweated out disease, anger, and ghosts, one drop at a time. The heat stripped the spirit until it glowed raw and clean. It wasn't comfort, it was confrontation, a battle between flesh and the invisible grime that clung to it. Blood followed a different rhythm. It was the paradox of purity. The most dangerous fluid was also the most powerful cleanser. In Mesoamerican rites, blood was the price of balance, offered back to the earth to prevent stagnation. In ancient Israel, it purified altars. In Vedic fire rituals, it was replaced with clarified butter, a cleaner symbol of the same transaction. Each drop acknowledged a truth no civilization has fully accepted. cleanliness is paid for. Something must always be burned, spilled, or surrendered to keep the order intact. And then there was smoke, the softest, most diplomatic of cleansers. It touched everything without leaving a mark. Incense curled through temples in Egypt, Judea, China, and Peru, carrying prayers upward and bacteria away. It was both purifier and messenger, proof that fire had done its work. Where water washed downward, smoke washed upward, reminding everyone that cleanliness, like everything else, had its directions. To the uninitiated, these substances looked barbaric. Western missionaries saw smoke baths and blood rites as evidence of superstition, conveniently ignoring their own use of wine and ashes. They didn't recognize that all religions run on combustion, some literal, some symbolic. Something must burn, and something must rise. Every culture's purifying element reflected its climate and its temperament. Where there was water, people washed. Where there was wind, they smoked. Where there was heat, they sweated. Where there was scarcity, they bled. The tools changed, but the principle didn't. Only through the body could the spirit be rinsed. Modern life hides this transaction under fluorescent light. Gyms, spas, detox retreats, the rituals survive, but the meaning evaporated. We still sweat, still burn, still exhale into scented air, pretending it's for health or pleasure. The old world would have called it worship. There was honesty in those older rites. They accepted that the same fluids that stained also saved. Sweat cooled, blood healed, smoke sanctified. Impurity was never banished, it was transformed. Cleansing meant transmutation, not denial. And when all three, sweat, blood, and smoke, met in one place, the result was almost alchemical. Purification by exhaustion. You emerged emptied, trembling, strangely serene. You didn't smell clean, not by modern standards, but you were usable again, reconnected to the web of things that required your participation. Because the dirtiest secret of all was this: to stay clean in a living world, you had to keep moving through its dirt. And those who understood that truth didn't wash their hands of existence, they washed them in it. At some point, humanity realized it could wash without water. The most powerful cleansing, it turned out, came not from soap, but from subtraction. When the body stopped taking in, something inside it started letting go. Fasting, silence, celibacy, the strange trinity of purification through absence. They cleaned not the skin, but the self that clung to it. In the deserts of Sinai, prophets fasted until hallucination blurred into revelation. They believed hunger scoured the soul, scraping away attachment like sandpaper. Every skipped meal was a step closer to God, and a few steps away from sanity. But to the ascetic, that was the point. Clarity often arrived, disguised as delirium. In the forests of India, yogis and renunciants did the same, surviving on air, rainwater, and a terrifying sense of purpose. Their cleanliness wasn't visible. Their hair matted, their nails blackened, their odor legendary. Yet the logic was consistent. The less you fed the body, the more transparent it became. Eventually, you stopped being a person and turned into a passage. Among Arctic shamans, isolation achieved a similar effect. They went into the tundra alone, sometimes for months, until their minds thinned enough for spirits to pass through. The cold was its own form of fasting from warmth, sound, and company. When they returned, eyes hollow and luminous, the community called them clean, not freshly washed, but stripped of excess humanity. The Navajo called this kind of purification Hazo balance. The idea that cleanliness wasn't the absence of dirt, but the absence of clutter, inner and outer. Too much desire, too much noise, too much self, all forms of impurity. Real cleansing meant narrowing the aperture until the world fit again. In medieval monasteries, this logic was institutionalized. Silence kept the tongue from sin. Fasting kept the flesh from arrogance. Celibacy kept the spirit from wandering. A monk was a full-time purification ritual in sandals. Their laundry may have been questionable, but their restraint was spotless. There's something quietly comic in it, the idea that humans, endlessly messy creatures, tried to reach purity by starving, freezing, and shutting up. But behind the absurdity was precision. Each act of deprivation reordered the inner world. Hunger humbled the ego, loneliness rinsed perception, abstinence clarified intention. They weren't moral punishments, they were calibration tools. Modern people still flirt with these rituals, usually under new branding. Detox, digital fasting, solo retreat. The vocabulary changed, the neurosis remained. We no longer fear angering the gods, only losing Wi-Fi. Yet the logic is identical. Remove the noise, the indulgence, the constant feeding, and maybe, just maybe, the spirit will resurface, blinking and disoriented, wondering why it was buried under so much comfort. In the old world, fasting ended, not with indulgence, but with ritual cleansing. The body was fragile, the spirit raw, both newly reacquainted. Eating again was ceremonial, slow, reverent, almost apologetic. The first bite wasn't pleasure, it was reintegration, and so, purification by absence proved more potent than any soap or smoke. It left no scent, no visible mark, only that peculiar stillness that settles after a storm has passed. The kind of clean that can't be touched, only felt. But the ancients weren't finished, because there was another realm where cleanliness grew complicated. The body's boundaries weren't the same for everyone. Clean and unclean began to divide, not just the visible from the invisible, but men from women, priest from layperson, sacred from profane. The moment purity became organized, someone decided it needed supervision, and, predictably, it was women who ended up under inspection. Across much of the ancient world, cleanliness stopped being a ritual condition and started being a gendered responsibility. Men performed purification, women embodied it. In ancient Israel, a woman after childbirth or menstruation wasn't unholy, merely in transition, but language has a way of curdling over time. What began as cosmology, the management of life's thresholds, hardened into stigma. Bleeding, birthing, lactating, natural acts that once linked women to divine cycles, became liabilities in a system obsessed with control. Ritual baths like the mikveh remained, but the tone shifted. What was once participation in sacred renewal became recovery from impurity. Egypt was gentler, at least officially. The goddess Isis governed fertility and healing, and her priestesses were keepers of sacred cleanliness. But even there, temple duties mirrored anatomy. Men handled the fire and stone, women the water and cloth. Cleanliness had texture and temperature, and each gender inherited its element. In Japan, Shinto shrines barred menstruating women from certain rituals, not out of hatred, but because blood was considered too sacred, too alive, a reminder that creation and destruction share plumbing. Purity here meant containment, not condemnation. Yet centuries later, when the logic was forgotten but the rules remained, what began as reverence calcified into exclusion. Among the Navajo, the menstrual hut told a different story. Seclusion wasn't punishment, it was power management. A woman's body was seen as temporarily overflowing with spiritual energy, potent, unstable, requiring its own sacred space. The same logic that labeled her impure in one culture, labeled her too powerful in another. The difference was who got to write the rules. It was never just about blood. Purity systems governed touch, proximity, and access. Who could enter the temple? Who could prepare food? Who could approach the sick or the dead? Women's bodies, being the most visibly cyclical, became the calendars of these laws. Every culture that feared disorder began to police those who produced life. Perhaps because creation is the messiest form of cleanliness there is. The irony, of course, is that while women were declared impure for bleeding, men were never disqualified for spilling blood in war. The same fluid, different context, one sanctified, one shamed. Purity was rarely consistent, only convenient. Still, these systems served more than control. They gave structure to mystery. They mapped the body's unpredictable rhythms onto cosmic order. The menstrual cycle became a kind of sacred calendar. Childbirth, a temple event. Abstinence, a form of political hygiene. Every discharge, every ritual bath, every law about clean days was a negotiation between biology and theology. The idea that cleanliness was spiritual became, in practice, a way of drawing lines between the touchable and the untouchable, the permitted and the forbidden. Purity codes weren't about dirt. They were about direction, who moved freely between worlds, and who was required to pause at the threshold. And even now, in modern echoes, the obsession with freshness, the coded marketing of feminine hygiene, the quiet moral tone around bodies that leak. You can hear the ghost of that old cosmology, stripped of divinity, but still humming beneath fluorescent light. Because once the body became political property, the spirit had to find subtler forms of cleansing. And where water or isolation could no longer reach, fire and smoke continued the work, burning the invisible, sterilizing the air, purifying what couldn't be washed away. Fire was humanity's first cleaner. Long before soap, long before ritual baths and scented oils, people understood that what burned was reborn. Flame erased what water couldn't reach, the invisible residues, the smells of death, the weight of bad dreams. Everything that touched fire came back lighter. Every civilization, in its own way, worshipped the act of burning. In ancient Vedic rites, offerings to Agni, god of fire, weren't just tributes, they were transactions. The gods didn't descend to accept gifts. The fire ascended, carrying them upward. Each spark a messenger, each wisp of smoke a receipt. The same principle flickered in Greek altars, Hebrew incense burners, and Roman hearths. Fire purified by translation. It turned matter into breath. Among indigenous peoples of North America, smoke was more than aroma. Smudging with sage, cedar, or sweetgrass didn't ward off bad energy in the modern wellness sense. It disinfected the air, repelled insects, and calmed the nervous system, all while cleansing the spirit. To pass through smoke was to re-enter balance. The rising columns carried prayers, but also bacteria. In a world without antiseptic, holiness was the original public health. Egyptians burned resins like frankincense and myrrh for similar reasons. They sweetened the tombs of the dead, sterilized wounds, and perfumed the temples of the living. The same substances appear in medical, papyri, and funeral hymns, medicine and worship indistinguishable, both relying on the same smoke to prove that something unseen had been purified. Even Christianity couldn't resist the impulse. The use of incense in cathedrals wasn't just theatrical. Medieval air, thick with disease and confession, needed cleansing. The priest swung the censer, and the scent rolled through the nave, equal parts prayer and fumigation, divine hygiene. In Japan, Shinto shrines still light hayo, sacred fires used to purify objects and spaces. Smoke rises through the torii gate like a signal to the heavens that all is in order. The fire itself is never extinguished by hand. It must die naturally, proving that the cleansing was complete. Everywhere, the logic stayed constant. Fire purifies because it consumes. It doesn't politely remove impurity. It annihilates it. The cleanest state is ash, lifeless, odorless, neutral. Civilizations built entire moral systems around that principle. The Hindu cremation ground, the Buddhist funeral pyre, the European bonfire of relics and sins, all expressions of the same belief that only through burning could the world start over. Even the domestic hearth, humble and private, carried echoes of the temple flame. Its smoke coiled through thatched roofs, coating them in antiseptic resin. The smell of smoke meant food, warmth, continuity, but also protection. A smoky hut was safer than a sterile one. Clean air, ironically, came later, with its own diseases of sterility and loneliness. Smoke made cleanliness visible. It revealed the process of purification, nothing hidden, everything transformed in plain sight. Where water washed downward and vanished, smoke rose, curling, lingering, reminding everyone that the act of cleaning had its own afterlife. And when the fires dimmed, another kind of purification took over, one that required no flame at all, only breath, because the dirtiest things of all were never the hands or the body, but the words that came out of them. Eventually, people realized the real dirt was inside. The body could be scrubbed raw, perfumed, or smoked like a ham, and still something stubborn clung beneath the ribs. Thoughts, words, intentions, invisible stains that no river could rinse. So humanity invented subtler detergents: confession, prayer, and breath. In medieval monasteries, monks lined up not for soap, but for absolution. They washed their souls by speaking, which was paradoxical, since silence was also considered purifying. The logic was poetic, if a bit neurotic: say the right words, or none at all. Either way, language was both the wound and the cure. What was confessed became clean. What stayed unspoken fermented. Catholic confessionals weren't unique. In Japan's Shinto shrines, people wrote their sins on paper and burned them. In India, devotees whispered, "There's two rivers." The Navajo enemy way ceremony chanted them into the wind. The idea was the same everywhere. Impurity left the body through sound. Breath carried it out, reshaped it into something the world could recycle. The ancient Egyptians took it literally. In the negative confession from the Book of the Dead, the deceased listed 42 things they had not done, a bureaucratic audit of purity. The heart was weighed against a feather, and if it proved too heavy with residue, It was fed to a crocodile goddess named Amit. The Egyptians understood moral hygiene with the efficiency of accountants. Breath itself became sacred technology. Yogic pranayama treated air as cleanser and bridge, each inhale drawing in the divine, each exhale expelling what didn't belong. Monks across Asia sat in stillness, watching their breath the way a jeweler watches a flame. It was maintenance of the inner atmosphere, a kind of spiritual lung hygiene. Even early Christians described prayer as breathing in the Spirit. Everyone, it seems, agreed that salvation was one good exhalation away. Across cultures, there was always an equation between guilt and grime. The unconfessed mind felt heavy, sluggish, foul. The cleansed one, light, transparent, nearly odorless. Even secular modernity kept the metaphor, washing one's hands of a crime, airing dirty laundry, clearing the air. The body still remembers the old connection between breath and conscience. Confession, however, was never just about honesty. It was about alignment. Words had weight, and by releasing them in the right order, people recalibrated the invisible machinery inside themselves. To tell the truth was to return to resonance. To lie was to coat the tongue in spiritual mildew, and those who mastered inner hygiene didn't just cleanse themselves, they cleaned the atmosphere around them. Entire monasteries, temples, and sweat lodges were designed as lungs. Inhale impurity, exhale sanctity, the architecture of breath. But breath had one flaw: it faded. You had to keep doing it. The same with confession, meditation, chanting the dirt always came back. Cleanliness, whether of skin or soul, was never permanent. The universe was too dusty for that. So while water, fire, and air handled the body, something more systemic began to change. As the divine retreated from daily life, cleanliness lost its ritual meaning and found a new patron, comfort. And that shift, from the sacred to the sanitary, changed not only how people washed, but why. Somewhere between the Industrial Revolution and the first scented soap commercial, humanity stopped washing for the gods and started washing for the mirror. Cleanliness, once a conversation with the cosmos, became a personal brand. The body was no longer a vessel, it was packaging. The sacred had always been inconvenient. Ritual baths at dawn, smoke ceremonies, fasting, shaving one's head in cold water, all demanded effort, patience, reverence. Modernity, allergic to effort, streamlined the process. Hot running water replaced the river. Perfume replaced prayer. The divine was outsourced to plumbing. By the 19th century, cleanliness was no longer a matter of spirit, but of social hierarchy. Soap was advertised as civilization itself, a ticket to moral superiority, whiteness with bubbles. Colonizers brought it to the tropics under the banner of hygiene, as if washing skin could wash away history. Cleanliness became propaganda, sterile, scented, and deeply political. The old logic inverted. Once, washing brought you closer to the sacred. Now it made you safe from nature. The world itself became dirty, full of microbes, odors, humidity, and other reminders of life. The mission was no longer to align with the environment, but to sterilize it. People built walls, filters, deodorants, and ideologies to keep nature and each other at bay. The result was spotless isolation. Even the rituals that survived lost their context. Burning sage in an apartment became wellness. Fasting turned into detox. Meditation apps replaced silence with subscription models. The gestures remained, but the cosmos stopped answering. Modern hygiene did achieve miracles: fewer plagues, fewer parasites, longer lives. But in the process, something essential was scrubbed away. The intimacy between body and world dissolved. Bathing no longer meant participation in order. It meant removal from it. The goal wasn't balance, it was control. In hospitals, the new temples of cleanliness, the smell of antiseptic replaced incense. Stainless steel became the new altar. Death was still there, of course, just out of sight, behind curtains and policies. The old rituals that once comforted the dying: washing, oiling, singing, were replaced by latex gloves and chemical wipes. Clean, yes. Holy, no. Even the home changed. The hearth went cold. Kitchens became laboratories. Bathrooms, once the domain of quiet renewal, turned into stage sets for self-care. The daily ablution, stripped of its metaphysical purpose, became maintenance, not of soul, but of presentation. And yet, in the quiet corners of daily life, the old instincts linger. The sigh of relief after cleaning a room, the strange calm of a hot shower after grief, the need to light a candle when the air feels heavy, the impulse to wash one's hands after touching the dead, even when no one's watching. These are fragments of an ancient grammar of purity habits that outlived belief. Because the truth is, the sacred never really left. It just learned to live in smaller rituals, the rinse of a glass, the slow exhale of a prayer you don't remember learning, the warmth of water on tired skin. Cleanliness still whispers what it once proclaimed, that the world, for all its dust, still wants to be tended. And perhaps that's all that remains of the old cosmic hygiene, the quiet understanding that every act of washing, however modern, is still an echo of an older promise, not that we'll be spotless, but that we'll try again tomorrow.